Daniel Harper wasn't just any coach. He was a celebrated mentor, a figure of authority who commanded respect and admiration. As the head coach of the Maplewood High volleyball team, Harper had a knack for bringing out the best in his players, leading them to multiple championships. His leadership was the envy of other schools, and his name was synonymous with success. For Jessica Miller, the star player and team captain, Harper's attention was a validation of her talent and hard work. It wasn't long before his praise turned into something darker. The changes were subtle at first. After practice, Harper would ask Jessica to stay behind for extra drills. It was supposed to be for her benefit, to fine-tune her skills. At first, Jessica was eager to impress him. She stayed late, hoping that these extra sessions would pay off in the form of more opportunities and perhaps a college scholarship. One evening, as the team had wrapped up for the day, Harper invited Jessica into the empty gym for a private session. "You've been working so hard, Jess," he said, his voice soft and encouraging. "Let's see what we can do to make you even better." Jessica, tired but hopeful, agreed. Harper led her through a series of drills. His instructions were always accompanied by touch, adjusting her stance, correcting her form. His hands were supposed to guide, but they lingered longer than necessary, moving from her shoulders to her hips. Jessica felt a shiver every time his fingers brushed against her skin, but she didn't want to disappoint him, so she kept quiet. As weeks passed, Harper's behavior grew increasingly invasive. His comments became more personal and his touch more inappropriate. One night after practice, Jessica was alone in the locker room, changing out of her sweaty uniform. Harper came in, ostensibly to discuss her performance. The locker room was dimly lit, the only sound the faint hum of the overhead lights. "I've been thinking," Harper began, his voice lower than usual. "You've got potential, Jess, but potential needs to be nurtured." He approached her, his gaze intense. Before Jessica could react, he placed his hands on her shoulders, guiding her into a position. His touch was meant to be instructional, but it was anything but. His hands roamed down her arms, his fingers brushing against her bare skin. Jessica tried to pull away, but Harper's grip tightened slightly. "Relax," he murmured, his breath warm against her neck. He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss just below her ear. Jessica's heart raced as she froze, her body rigid with shock. Harper's lips lingered, his hands moving dangerously close to her chest. "Harper, please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Stop." Harper's eyes met hers, but his expression remained unreadable. "It's just a bit of encouragement, Jess. You need to understand what it takes to be the best." Terrified and confused, Jessica grabbed her things and fled the locker room. She hurried to her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. She couldn't understand why she was so afraid, why Harper's touch felt so wrong. She had always respected him, and now that respect was tainted with fear and confusion. The following days were a blur for Jessica. Harper's presence became more suffocating. He would find excuses to be close to her, to touch her. During practice, he would demonstrate techniques with his hands lingering on her body longer than needed. His comments became increasingly suggestive. "You look incredible today," he'd whisper, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. One evening, Harper set up another private session, but this time he had an additional task for Jessica. "You've been a bit distracted lately," he said, his voice firm. "We need to work on your focus. I want you to stay after and help me clean up." Jessica was hesitant, but she knew better than to refuse. After practice, she stayed behind, scrubbing the floors and organizing the equipment. Harper watched her from a distance, his gaze making her uncomfortable. As she worked, he approached, pretending to offer help. "Great job, Jess," he said, his hand brushing against her back. The touch was more than casual. It was deliberate, lingering. "But you know, focus isn't just about the game. It's about everything." He moved closer, his breath hot on her neck. His hands began to explore inappropriately, touching her in ways that made her skin crawl. Jessica stiffened, her hands shaking as she held the mop. "Coach, I really need to finish this," she said, her voice trembling. But Harper's hands were insistent, sliding down her arms and touching her waist. "Just relax," he said softly. "You're doing so well." The following days were a blur for Jessica. Harper's presence became more suffocating. He would find excuses to be close to her, to touch her. During practice, he would demonstrate techniques with his hands lingering on her body longer than needed. His comments became increasingly suggestive. "You look incredible today," he'd whisper, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. One evening, Harper set up another private session, but this time he had an additional task for Jessica. "You've been a bit distracted lately," he said, his voice firm. "We need to work on your focus. I want you to stay after and help me clean up." Jessica was hesitant, but she knew better than to refuse. After practice, she stayed behind, scrubbing the floors and organizing the equipment. Harper watched her from a distance, his gaze making her uncomfortable. As she worked, he approached, pretending to offer help. "Great job, Jess," he said, his hand brushing against her back. The touch was more than casual. It was deliberate, lingering. "But you know, focus isn't just about the game. It's about everything." He moved closer, his breath hot on her neck. His hands began to explore inappropriately, touching her in ways that made her skin crawl. Jessica stiffened, her hands shaking as she held the mop. "Coach, I really need to finish this," she said, her voice trembling. But Harper's hands were insistent, sliding down her arms and touching her waist. "Just relax," he said softly. "You're doing so well." Jessica could feel tears stinging her eyes as Harper's touch grew more invasive. She wanted to push him away, but fear kept her paralyzed. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. "I have to go," she said, her voice cracking. She gathered her things and fled the gym, her heart pounding in her chest. Harper's behavior didn't stop. Jessica found herself constantly on edge, avoiding him as much as possible. But he always found ways to corner her. The once safe and supportive environment of the volleyball team had turned into a place of fear and dread for her. Her performance began to suffer. She missed easy shots, fumbled serves, and avoided eye contact with her teammates. The secret she was keeping was taking a toll on her, making her feel isolated and powerless. Even though she knew she had to do something, she felt trapped, unable to escape the situation without exposing everything. The once revered coach was now a source of terror in Jessica's life, his actions overshadowing the sport she once loved. As she tried to navigate her way through the chaos, the weight of her secret grew heavier, and the consequences of Harper's betrayal became increasingly apparent. Ryan Brooks, the student manager for the Maplewood High volleyball team, had always admired Jessica Miller from afar. Her skill on the court and her leadership as team captain made her a figure of admiration. Lately, though, Ryan had noticed something unsettling. Jessica had become distant and distracted, no longer the confident and driven leader she once was. Something was clearly bothering her, but Ryan couldn't figure out what it was. One evening, Ryan stayed late to help clean up the gym after practice. He had been trying to get a better understanding of what was happening, and the gym's empty, echoing halls provided a chance to observe without being noticed. As he worked, he saw Jessica lingering behind, scrubbing the floors and organizing the equipment. Harper was also present, ostensibly overseeing the cleanup. Ryan observed Harper's behavior from a distance. The coach seemed to be more involved in Jessica's work than necessary. He was giving her instructions, but his tone was overly intimate, his hands lingering too long on her shoulders and back. At one point, Ryan saw Harper's hands slide down Jessica's side, brushing against her hip in a way that was far from professional. Harper leaned in close, his lips brushing Jessica's ear as he whispered something that made her shiver. Jessica stiffened but didn't pull away. The way Harper was touching her and the way he looked at her were deeply disturbing. Ryan's anger grew. He wanted to intervene but feared doing so might make things worse. He decided to keep a close watch and gather more information before taking any action. A few days later, during another late practice session, Harper's behavior escalated further. Jessica was alone in the gym, running drills under Harper's supervision. His instructions became increasingly intimate. He would position her, his hands lingering as he adjusted her stance, his touch becoming more invasive. He would place his hands on her lower back, guiding her movements with a touch that bordered on inappropriate. During one drill, Harper had Jessica perform a series of jumps and stretches. As she executed each movement, Harper's hands roamed. He would lightly brush against her thighs and hips, and on one occasion, he slipped his fingers just beneath her shorts, making Jessica flinch. She tried to ignore the growing discomfort, focusing on completing the drill as best she could. "Excellent form," Harper said, his voice warm and encouraging, but his touch was anything but reassuring. He placed his hands on her shoulders, and then, without warning, leaned in to kiss her neck. It was a brief, fleeting kiss, but it left a lasting impression on Jessica. She tensed, her heart racing as Harper's lips made contact with her skin. "You're doing so well," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear. Jessica's body betrayed her. Despite the fear and confusion, a part of her responded to Harper's touch. She felt a strange mix of shame and arousal, her emotions in turmoil. She tried to convince herself it was just Harper's way of showing support, but deep down she knew it was wrong. The once clear lines between coach and player had become hopelessly blurred. The situation only worsened when Harper began making demands that extended beyond practice. One afternoon, he asked Jessica to come to his office after school. "I need you to help me with some administrative tasks," he said, his tone casual but his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her uncomfortable. Jessica reluctantly agreed. When she arrived at Harper's office, he had a stack of papers ready for her to sort. As she worked, Harper moved around the room, his presence unnervingly close. He would brush past her intentionally, his hand grazing her arm or hip as he accidentally knocked papers off the desk. Each touch felt deliberate, a subtle reminder of his control over her. At one point, Harper leaned over Jessica, his body pressing against her as he reached for a pen. His hand brushed against her backside, and he made no effort to pull away. "You're doing a great job, Jess," he said, his voice low and sultry. He leaned in to kiss her neck, his lips lingering longer than usual. Jessica froze, her heart pounding as she tried to process what was happening. Her mind screamed for her to move away, but her body remained paralyzed. Harper's touch felt both thrilling and terrifying. She found herself questioning her own responses, wondering why she didn't simply push him away. One evening, after a particularly intense practice, Jessica was alone in the gym, tidying up equipment. Harper came in, his expression inscrutable. "I wanted to talk to you about your performance," he said, his voice smooth and calm. He approached her, his touch familiar and unsettling. As Harper spoke, his hands roamed freely. He touched her shoulders, then slid his fingers down her arms. Jessica tried to focus on his words, but his touch was distracting. Harper's hand moved lower, brushing against her lower back and then sliding down to her hips. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, "You know, you could be so much more if you just let go and trusted me." Jessica's breath hitched as Harper's hand made its way to her backside, his fingers lingering there. She flinched, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and confusion. "Coach, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't right." Harper's response was calm and dismissive. "It's just a bit of encouragement, Jess. You need to relax and understand what it takes to succeed." He continued his inappropriate touch, making Jessica feel trapped in a web of manipulation and fear. By this point, Jessica was struggling with her own feelings. Despite the discomfort and fear, she began to feel a twisted sense of dependency on Harper's attention. His touches, though unwanted, started to create a complex emotional reaction. She felt shame, but there was also a disturbing sense of validation whenever Harper showed her attention. She couldn't reconcile these conflicting emotions, and it only made the situation more confusing. Ryan, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly concerned. He had seen enough to know that something was terribly wrong. He decided to take action. After practice one day, he confronted Jessica. "I've seen the way he's been treating you," Ryan said, his voice filled with concern. "You need to tell someone. This isn't right." Jessica looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. "He's been so insistent, and I don't know how to make him stop." Ryan's frustration grew. "You have to speak up. I can't stand by and watch this happen. If you don't say something, nothing will change." Jessica was torn. She knew Ryan was right, but she feared the consequences. Harper's control over her had made her feel powerless, and she was scared of what might happen if she defied him. Yet deep down, she knew she had to find the courage to confront the situation. The following week, Harper's behavior escalated further. He began to isolate Jessica, pulling her away from the rest of the team for special sessions. His touch became more aggressive, his kisses more forceful. Jessica felt trapped, unable to escape the nightmare she found herself in. One day, after a particularly intense session, Harper made Jessica stay behind to help with some tasks in the gym. As she worked, Harper's touch became increasingly invasive. He would brush against her, his hands lingering on her body, making her skin crawl. He would whisper dirty comments, telling her how beautiful she looked and how much potential she had, all while his hands roamed freely. Jessica tried to ignore his advances, focusing on her tasks, but it was impossible to escape the reality of his touch. Harper's actions left her feeling violated and conflicted, as her emotions became a tangled mess of fear, shame, and a warped sense of validation. She struggled to maintain her composure, but the weight of Harper's unwanted attention was taking a severe toll on her mental health. By now, Jessica's once promising volleyball career was overshadowed by the dark shadow of Harper's manipulation. The sport she loved had become a battleground of psychological and emotional abuse. Despite her growing feelings of self-loathing and despair, Jessica felt helpless, unable to break free from the coach who had twisted her sense of self-worth. Ryan's concern grew with each passing day. He continued to gather evidence of Harper's behavior, documenting the inappropriate touches and suggestive comments. He knew he had to act soon, but he also knew that confronting Harper directly could have dangerous consequences. Ryan was determined to protect Jessica, but the weight of the situation was becoming overwhelming. As Jessica continued to grapple with the nightmare unfolding around her, the line between trust and betrayal grew ever more blurred. The once clear path of her future was now obscured by the darkness of Harper's influence. The journey ahead was fraught with peril, and the decisions she made would have far-reaching consequences for both herself and those around her. September 12th was a night that Jessica Miller would never forget. The once bright promise of her future had been overshadowed by the darkness of her relationship with Coach Daniel Harper. The constant manipulation and abuse had left her feeling trapped and powerless. Determined to confront the situation, Jessica decided to meet Harper at the gym after hours. The gym was eerily quiet as Jessica arrived. The only sound was the distant hum of the air conditioning. Harper was already there, waiting in the shadows, his expression inscrutable. Jessica's heart raced as she approached him. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her. Harper's face remained calm, but there was an unsettling glint in his eyes. "I'm listening," he said, his tone smooth. He gestured for her to follow him to the center of the gym. The fluorescent lights above cast long shadows, and the silence seemed to press in on them. As Jessica spoke, trying to gather her courage, Harper's demeanor shifted. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Jess," he said softly, "we've been through so much together. You know how much potential you have." His hands reached out, touching her shoulders in a way that made her skin crawl. Before Jessica could react, Harper's lips were on hers, pressing a forceful, invasive kiss. The shock of it left her paralyzed for a moment. She wanted to pull away, to escape, but Harper's grip tightened, his hands sliding down her back and pulling her closer. Jessica's mind raced. She felt a mixture of fear, confusion, and an odd sense of validation. Harper's kiss was rough, demanding, and filled with a possessiveness that left her feeling violated. As Harper's kiss deepened, his hands moved lower, reaching for the waistband of her pants. He began to unbutton them, his touch becoming increasingly intrusive. Jessica's heart pounded as she struggled to push him away. "Stop!" she cried out, her voice breaking with fear and desperation. "This is wrong!" Harper's face twisted into a cold, angry expression. "You don't understand, Jess. I'm trying to help you, to make you better. You're just too blind to see it." Jessica, trembling with fear, managed to slap Harper hard across the face. "Get your hands off me!" she screamed. "I'll tell the police about this. I swear I will." Harper's expression darkened further, his eyes burning with rage. "You think you can threaten me? You think anyone will believe you over me?" His voice was a dangerous growl. Jessica tried to pull away, but Harper's grip was unrelenting. In a sudden, brutal act of violence, he pulled out a concealed knife from his jacket pocket. With a swift, violent motion, he plunged it into Jessica's chest. Her eyes widened in shock and pain as she gasped, her blood staining the gym floor. Harper looked at her lifeless body with a mixture of cold satisfaction and grim reality. He quickly wiped the knife clean and stuffed it back into his jacket. The brutal act was over in moments, leaving Jessica's bloodied body in a silent, haunting scene. Ryan Brooks, who had followed Jessica to the gym out of concern, had witnessed the horrific scene from his hiding spot. He had seen Harper's assault, the deadly confrontation, and Jessica's final moments. His shock quickly turned into a storm of rage and desperation. Ryan rushed into the gym, finding Jessica's body and Harper's sinister presence. The reality of what had just happened was overwhelming. He grabbed a nearby weight and, driven by a mix of grief and anger, attacked Harper, determined to stop him from escaping justice. The police arrived shortly after, responding to the scene of violence. They found Jessica's body and quickly took Ryan into custody. Harper managed to escape the scene, leaving behind the grim evidence of his crimes. The investigation revealed the full extent of Harper's crimes. The court case was highly publicized, revealing the details of Harper's assault and murder of Jessica, as well as his role in the murder of Emily Carter, a student whose body had been discovered near the gym. The evidence presented was damning. Harper was eventually apprehended and charged with multiple counts of murder and sexual assault. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized the severity of his crimes and the irreversible damage he had caused. Jessica's tragic death and the ensuing violence had a profound impact on the Maplewood community. The volleyball program was disbanded, and the school implemented new policies and support systems to address and prevent abuse. The community rallied around Jessica's memory and worked towards creating safer environments for students. Jessica's bravery in coming forward and her tragic fate became a catalyst for change. Her story highlighted the importance of speaking out against abuse and the need for vigilance in protecting those who are vulnerable. Despite the pain and loss, her legacy contributed to meaningful changes in how abuse and violence were addressed within the community.